Hello BookTube. Today is part 16 of my science fiction and fantasy library tour. So we've got this one and tomorrow's, and then we will be done with the library tour. So let's begin. First we have the third book in the Aeon's Gate trilogy, The Skybound Sea by Sam Sykes. And it's a former library book from Elmhurst Public Library in Elmhurst, Illinois. And I have the first book in his most recent trilogy, Seven Blades in Black, the first book in the Graves of Empire series. I know there's a trilogy or a series between the Aeon's Gate and the Graves of Empire, but I don't have them yet. Next, I have a collection of Adrian Tchaikovsky's Shadows of the Alps series. This is Empire in Black and Gold, the first book. I read it earlier this year and I thought it was okay. Probably give this another reread before I start on the rest of the series. So picked it up from Hastings Books a few years ago when they were closing down. It's one of those books that I've been interested in collecting for a while and finally picked it up. So this is book 2, Dragonfly Falling. Used library book from Cedar Mill Library. Horrible placement for the barcode. This is book 3, Blood of the Mantis. This one is from Horsham Township Library in Horsham, Pennsylvania. The third book in the series is Salute the Dark. And this does not appear to be a former library book. And this is the 5th book in the series, The Scarab Path, which again, no, I do not believe is a former library book. Next, I have the first 2 books in Naman Gobert Tullahan's The Wrath and Athenaeum series. This is The Root. I read this a few times and I quite like it, although I do think there are way too many point of view characters that muddy the story. But I'm looking forward to getting back to the series when book 3 comes out in August of 2020. And so this is the second book in the trilogy, The Tree. So obviously if we begin with The Root and we continue with The Tree, the third book will be The Fruit, which comes out again August of 2020. So moving on from Tullahan, we have some Tolkien. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, and The Lord of the Rings, with the movie cover and I guess the movie tie-in version, which I wish I'd have. I want to get a better copy edition of this one. I mean, I want a 1 volume, but I would like a not movie tie-in version. It's been a while since I've read The Lord of the Rings, so I really should get around to it again. Next, we have some anthologies. First is The Very Best of Science Fiction and Fantasy, the 60th Anniversary Anthology, edited by Gordon Van Gelder. So this collects a lot of the classic stories from the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction over, I guess, 60 years. So some of the stories in here are I had this in my collection a few years ago. Bought it at Barnes & Noble, and then I purged it, years ago, and have kicked myself ever since. So I'm quite happy to have a new copy in my collection. So there's stories by Alfred Bester, Ray Bradbury, Shirley Jackson, Theodore Sturgeon, William Tenn, Daniel Keyes, Kurt Vonnegut, Roger Zelazny, Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, James Tiptree Jr., Damon Knight, Stephen King, Karen Joy Fowler, John Kessel, Ursula K. Le Guin, Michael Swanwick, Terry Bison, Jeffrey Ford, Neil Gaiman, Peter S. Beagle, M. Brickert, and Ted Chiang. And now we have 3 anthologies edited by Jeff and Ann Vandermeer. Starting off with The New Weird. So I think I hauled this one earlier in a book haul, but to reiterate, this is an anthology of collecting some of the earliest short fiction of the New Weird, which is a relatively new genre in science fiction and fantasy that takes as its inspiration the early proto-science fiction and fantasy weird genre that existed before science fiction and fantasy sort of became what we think of as science fiction and fantasy. And the New Weird sort of adds a more literary bent to it, a more imaginative take, and that sort of thing. I quite enjoyed this anthology. I read it a few years ago from my library, and I've wanted this edition. I've wanted it ever since. So there's some like really early proto-New Weird stories by M. John Harrison, Clive Barker, Michael Moorcock, Simon D. Eames, Kath Koja, and Thomas Ligotti. And then more stories that are considered part of the genre proper. China Medieval, Jeffrey Thomas, Jay Lake, whose story in here, The Lizard of Ooze, is fantastic. Brian Evanson, K.J. Bishop, Jeffrey Ford, Lena Crone, Steph Swainston, Alistair Rennie, whose story in here, The Gutter Sees the Light That Never Shines, is amazing. And I know there's at least another short story by him, but I don't think he's really published anything else, which is a shame because I really enjoyed both The Gutter Sees the Light That Never Shines and the other story by him, which I really need to make a note to look up and see if he has published anything. And then it gets into some critical looking at the New Weird, and then a sort of round robin story, which I think I kind of had an issue with this part, the symposium and the laboratory part. I thought they probably could have tried to find a few more short stories to put in here. But yeah, I'm happy with it and really enjoyed it. And next I have Steampunk, which is I think the first of several steampunk anthologies they put out. This one has, and it's a former library book from the Lambton County Library. So there's a story by Michael Moorcock, James Blaylock, Einar MacLeod, Mary Gentle, Jay Lake, whose story in here, The God Clown is Near, is amazing. J.R. Lansdale, Molly Brown, Ted Chiang, who's, I think, I really like 72 Letters. Michael Chabon, Paul DeFilippo, Rachel E. Pollack, Stephen Chapman, Neil Stevenson, Rick Claw, and yeah, so anywho. Although one thing to note about the New Weird anthology, in the introduction, there was some talk of the New Weird being an incredibly short-lived genre. That it basically sort of formed in like the late 90s, early 2000s, and basically by the time the anthology appeared in 2008, the genre had petered out, which I think in hindsight was probably not entirely a wise prognostication, because the New Weird seems to still be chugging along quite merrily. Anyway, so the final anthology by Anna J. Vandermeer I have is The Big Book of Classic Fantasy. So in the past few years, Anna and Jeff Vandermeer have collaborated on an anthology of the weird, which is this really big book that I want, and a classic science fiction collection. And this is their fantasy one, which came out a few months ago. Oh, the authors in here are... Well, it's going to be a long one. There's a lot. So there's like The Queen's Son by Bettina von Arnim, Hans my Hedgehog by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, The Story of the Hard Nut by E.T.A. Hoffman, Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, The Luck of the Bean Rose by Charles Nodier, Transformation by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, The Nest of Nightingales by Théophile Gautier, The Fairy Tale About a Dead Body Belonging to No One Knows Whom by Vladimir Udoevsky, The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton by Charles Dickens, The Nose by Nikolai Gogol, The Facts in the Case of Monsieur Valdemar by Edgar Allan Poe, The Story of Gian Unchi by Anonymous, Feathertop of Moralized Legend by Nathaniel Hawthorne, Master Zacharias by Jules Verne, The Frost King or The Power of Love by Louisa May Alcott, The Tartarus of Maids by Herman Melville, which I think I've read. And I'm not entirely sure I actually like that one. The Magic Mirror by George MacDonald, and yeah, a lot of other writers in here. So I might actually do a project, I think, next year, where I will pick an anthology and read it when I have some time, and then talk about them after I finish. So moving on, I have 3 books in the War Powers series. I think there are 4, by Robert E. Vardaman and Victor Milan. The Sundered Realm, The City in the Glacier, and The Destiny Stone. So I picked these all up from Golden's Book Exchange for some odd reason. I think I was really wanting to read a lot of more 70s science fiction and fantasy, and I thought they looked interesting. I read The Sundered Realm and didn't particularly care for it, but I might give it another read before deciding whether or not I want to do some unhauling. So next we go to Catherynne M. Valenti. This is Radiance, which, if you watched my video of how Steve read this science fiction and fantasy edition, I mentioned this book as one that I thought Steve might not have read. And this is by far my favorite novel by Catherynne M. Valenti that I've read. I just absolutely love this book. Next, we have The Refrigerator Monologues by Catherynne M. Valenti. This book I have tried to read. I've tried to read about twice. It basically is a riff on superhero comic books. The title refers firstly to Women in Refrigerators, which is a narrative technique in comic books and probably expanding out to other media, wherein a character, a supporting character, usually a woman, is killed, murdered, to provide motivation for usually a male superhero or other hero to do their heroing. And this comes from a story in Green Lantern. So basically, since the 60s up until the mid 90s, the Green Lantern was Hal Jordan. And he was basically a space cop. He was a member of the Green Lantern Corps. He had a green power ring that could form whatever he wanted or could imagine. And he was one of the great superheroes until the death of Superman. So in the early 90s, DC decided to kill Superman. And they did this by having Superman fight to the supervillain called Doomsday to the death. Well, Superman, I mean, the nature of comic books, Superman's death lasted about a year or so. And during that time, there was numerous sort of Superman type characters who rose up to claim the mantle. One of these was a Cyborg, who was eventually revealed to be the main antagonist of this Return of Superman storyline. And one of his actions was with his alien ally to destroy Coast City, which was the home base of Green Lantern on Earth. So in DC Comics, each superhero tends to have their own city that they patrol and defend, whereas in Marvel, most of them are all in New York. Anyway, so Hal Jordan is beside himself. He's trying everything he can to bring Coast City back. And he goes to the elders, the Guardians of the Universe, hoping they could help him, and they refuse. They don't have the power, or they find it morally reprehensible or something. And this drives Hal Jordan insane. He becomes a supervillain called Parallax, which later Parallax will be revealed to be an emotional entity that is the opposite of the Green Lanterns, and it became a thing. But anyway, so Hal Jordan goes insane, becomes this villain called Parallax, and proceeds to slaughter the Green Lantern Corps en masse and the Guardians of the Universe, leaving behind a single ring and a single Guardian. So this Guardian, Ganthet, takes the last ring and searches the universe for the last Green Lantern, who happens to be a young artist named Kyle Rayner. Kyle Rayner has a girlfriend, Alex DeWitt, who initially encourages him to be a superhero. And shortly thereafter, she is murdered by the supervillain Major Force and is stuffed in a refrigerator. Hence, Women in Refrigerators. This incident caught the notice of Gail Simone, who campaigned against this type of narrative. I think she founded a website, Women in Refrigerators or something, and it went off from there. And of course, monologues refers to the vagina monologues, which I'm not as well versed in that. So, anyway, so basically this book takes on numerous superhero stories, from Gwen Stacy and the Phoenix to Mera, Harley Quinn, I think Alex DeWitt herself, and just sort of like, I mean, it's a different story. But I mean, you can basically, if you know your comic books, you can pick who she's riffing off of. And just, I don't think these stories are particularly well written. and the tendency, if once you figure like, okay, who these characters remind you of, or stories, that you're comparing it to the stories. And unfortunately, these stories are quite wanting, and it's rather disappointing. So, yeah. Anyway, next up we have a novel by Catherynne and Valenti from a few years ago, Space Opera. This is basically where, in lieu of interstellar war, you basically have Eurovision in space. And yeah, and I'm assuming it's some weird stuff. I think I've read bits of it, but I haven't really read it completely yet, so I probably should do that soon. So next we wrap up with some Brent Weeks and Martha Wells. This is the Night Angel Trilogy by Brent Weeks. This is The Black Prism, the first book in the Lightbringer series, which I think I picked this up from Hastings. And then I have, or might have been somewhere, I don't remember. Then we have The Blinding Knife, Lightbringer Book 2, which this one came from Hastings. The Broken Eye, Lightbringer Part 3. And finally we wrap up with City of Bones by Martha Wells. Yeah. So that was part 16 of my library tour. So tomorrow we will wrap up with part 17. Until then, thank you, BookTube.